Okay, thank you all for joining in. This is the meeting organized, a webinar organized by the Teachers Against the Climate Crisis, which is a non-funded organization that's been active for the last few months. And broadly, our role is to develop understanding among teachers at different levels, both at the university and in schools, and also among students, and also in the hope that one would seek to intervene in the crisis. Among our activities, we had some meetings before the lockdown, meetings in colleges and Delhi University and so on. And since then, we've been having a series of webinars. Today is the 12th. It's on the history and the climate crisis, insights from recent scholarship by Dr. Anish Vanaik. And before I pass it on to Prabhu Mohapatra, I would just say that our email group is teachers against the climate crisis at gmail.com. And if you wish to get in touch with us, I'll add the Gmail in the chat box. So you can do so for future talks and so on. Okay, Prabhu, let me now pass it on to you. Thank you. And thank you, Anish.
Okay. Thank you, Naga. Thank you, Vandana. Thank you, Anish, who's going to present today. I have a very brief introduction. Anish is teaching. Anish has done his PhD in history, and he's been a student at Jawaharlal Nehru University and at Oxford, and he's currently teaching at Jindal, OP Jindal Global University. And this is, I suppose, he is actually a historian, urban history person who's done a brilliant book recently on property rights in Delhi. That is what part of his research work, or was his research. But now, and that's, Anish is going to present today some of the recent researches which has gone into the way historians are dealing with question of climate in the present as well as in the past. Now, and we'll get to hear his, I have just, I would like to just frame this thing a little bit in my own way, that I've been always wondering, how do we look at the question of climate change as historians? I'm a historian, and I share with Anish that what vocation being a historian, because the way most people who have looked at or say climate scientists have looked at questions of precedence or the question of history in climate has been in some ways looking at two opposing ways of doing it. One is looking at the trend of the past and seeing and projecting what will happen in the future. That's one. But the other has been to think of certain periods as discontinuous and disruptive. And the way historians have handled these questions famously under the rubric of continuity or and change, or in the way we have looked at questions of structures and process, may provide us some of the, like what Anish promises us, that it is not to find answers to the questions of climate crisis. That is what is important. But the point is, do we increase our repertoire of tools or the ways of looking which historians can provide? And I think there's no one better than Anish to introduce us to this toolbox approach, to historians' toolbox approach to studying or understanding climate and climate change. Up to you, Anish, now. Yeah. Thank you, Anish.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm going to begin with a number of caveats. And the first of these is that, unlike all the other talks in this series, as far as I can tell, this is not the research that I'm doing or have done. What I'm presenting to you is, I'm not an environmental historian. I'm not currently doing research in the area. I might do something in the future, but if at all, that's early days. And it's in fact through my interest in TACC that I have even got interested in sort of offering the course on history and climate. And what I'm presenting today is really a result of the first time I've dipped my toes in the literature and the first time I've tried to teach something about it. So if there's interest in that question, I'm happy to field questions about sort of the course that I taught and so on. But this is not really a result of my research. So it's really a survey of secondary material. The second thing that I wanted to sort of highlight is that I've left a lot of things out. The literature is now getting quite vast on climate crisis, climate history, as I will mention. And I've had to be very, very selective, and I've had to select quite drastically, including, actually, I'm going to at the outset say that I'm not going to be able to deliver on something that I missed, which was the intellectual history of the Cold War bit. I've also not included very much of the literature from India. And in the Q&A, if those are directions that people want to explore, I'm very happy to talk about what I know about this. So I've been very selective. There's a lot more out there. I'll point to some of that stuff which is out there. I'm going to point right away. So the topic I've set myself up for is to offer a sample of how historians have responded to the climate crisis. What are the questions they are asking? As Prabhu says, what are the kinds of tools that are sort of starting to get available? And in what ways can historians, I think Prabhu framed the question quite well, how can historians contribute to the public debate and to the kind of activism that we, among others, are hoping to engage with? After all, historians don't typically generate policy briefs. We don't have this in common with other social sciences. So what is it that we can bring to the table? And the only way I know how to answer that question really is to sort of talk a little bit about what we've been doing, and maybe some suggestions then from there about perhaps sort of what kind of conversation can flow from there. Let me begin, first of all, then, with the question that all historians, whoever they are, wherever they are concerned about, which is the issue of time and dating. It's a very critical question. It's a question that has been answered by the Anthropocene Working Group. In May 2019, the working group has voted overwhelmingly to declare for a new geological era. That's one thing that they agreed to declare for, that there should be a geological era. It's not come through yet, but the working group has passed it along. And secondly, actually for a mid-20th century date, for the commencement of the Anthropocene. They've agreed to those things. Apart from the mid-20th century, the only other historical reference in their brief update is to mention industrialization. Right? So that's what the Anthropocene Working Group has said. How have historians fared on this question? And here, actually, what we begin to find is that there are two versions of the story that are coming up. One version, which is by far the largest set of historians, tend to talk about the recent past as the beginning of the Anthropocene. That can overlap, can coincide with the Anthropocene Working Group's definitions. They are, of course, making a geological case. Historians are trying to talk about something a little bit different. What are the social dynamics that are in place, if you like? So, for instance, colonialism, sometimes dated from the end of the is one possible date that has been proposed by some historians. Others more conventionally, and this might be shared with the Anthropocene Working Group, will talk which is the term that has emerged to describe this period from 1945 onwards, from where actually you're going to find the most clear, concrete upswings in the graphs of a whole number of sort of key markers. And so this is why the Anthropocene Working Group has sort of coalesced around the geological period, at least starting from the Great Acceleration, post-World War II. Historians are not necessarily most keen to use this. In fact, they tend to be a little bit more century, or in fact, much more commonly, Industrial Revolution. We'll talk a little bit more about this recent dating. But there's another dating tradition that seems to have emerged in both history as well as in the humanities more generally. And that talks about the more distant past. There's a sort of scientific basis version of this. William Ruddiman famously claimed that the big ways in which human beings have transformed the climate system actually date back to well before the use of fossil fuels and have to do with land use patterns for the most part. That is to say, agriculture and the ways in which agriculture has transformed land use should be seen as the origin point. For others, it's when hominids or a certain group of hominids started to use fire. And now we're talking about many tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago is the kind of time scale on which we are talking about these kinds of datings, right? So you've got this sort of broad two patterns of talking about this. What is interesting is that whether directly as a result of Anthropocene, and a number of indicators are there to say that the Anthropocene is a prompter of this, or for a variety of instant past dating has become quite a common thing. And history, it takes the form or the formulation of something called deep history. And the number of, these two are probably the most common, these are bestsellers, probably the most common versions of this. But there's a whole host of others, actually. You've got a bunch of people who are trying to talk about, in different ways, deep history, the origin stories, big histories, that are trying to take into account these massive time scales, right? So John L. Brooks' book here is among the most, is among those which is dealing most directly with the Anthropocene. And in his chronological account, what he terms the modern condition begins at 1350, so AD 1350, and he starts at page 333. Post 1945, the period of the Great Acceleration, gets 30 pages out of 617, right? So one of the things that's happening, and whether this is out of design, some of these people are very directly responding to the Anthropocene narrative, but some of them are not. Some of them are coming to this kind of deep history, long history, universal histories of various sorts, for other reasons altogether. Now, what's interesting about this? What's interesting about this is, for one, Alice Ashford, historian from Australia, actually points to a really interesting irony, which is that the geologists suddenly seem to be taking up short time spans, 1945 onwards, while the historians seem to be keen to take up these really, really vast and long time spans. Right? So what's going on here? This is a fairly unique irony in that sense. And really it points back that in many ways, deep history, universal history, big history is not necessarily the only way to respond to this. In fact, in many ways, geologists are pointing to the fact that maybe it isn't sort of this deep history that's crucial for this. So what's going on here? And I would suggest to you that in this interest in when was the Anthropocene, and this coincidence, perhaps not an accident, of the emergence of big histories with Anthropocene narrative, are two questions that are at the heart of them. First, the question of agency. Right? And the sharpest way of posing this question is it the human species itself which is in some way responsible? And the Anthropocene narrative, or some readings of the Anthropocene narratives, do suggest that this is true. And in fact, there's often a misreading in some of the Capitalocene, Anthropocene debates about how to think about this question. But really, it's in the social science and humanities literature that we're finding the most radical claims to this end, that it is in fact the human species being that in some way deteriorates its environment and so on. So the agent is human beings per se in this kind of landscape. The second thing that I think is going on here is, and that's an interesting thing to think about. We'll have more to say about agency when we get to some of the later parts of the discussion. But the other thing that I think is going on here is that you're bringing together science and history, and all of these accounts do this in various ways and to various degrees. And the two sciences actually that seem to have emerged most centrally are either biology, particularly as rendered in various forms of sociobiology, or climate science. And these happen to be the two most important branches of science that are getting picked up in this historical literature. And it's worth thinking about why it is. I will say that I'm much more troubled and much less convinced by the ways in which biology is being picked up in a lot of this literature, compared to the way in which the climate science is being picked up. And we can discuss that in a very interesting set of ways. DNA and neurobiology in particular are making their way into these deep historical claims, which are often, to my mind at least, not really tenable or good versions of history. But as Alison Bashford points out, this big history ethos is not something that's restricted to the discipline of history. In fact, in many ways, the emergence of things like Ancestry.com and all these DNA testing things that are happening in the US is really testament to the fact that within the broader zeitgeist, there is this interest in these deep genetic questions. What that means, what that presages, what that points to is something else that we're going to have to explore. I don't necessarily think anything good, but it's certainly something that is happening and is part of this set of phenomena. But to my mind, the most interesting way in which science and history have come together as a result of climate change and the climate crisis, to my mind, it has to do really with the field, the subfield that is emerging, which is called climate history, right? And I'm putting this up here right now. You can have a look, but I'm not going to discuss it until a little bit later. The climate crisis's impact on climate science itself has been to demand ever more carefully refined models of climate mechanisms and all sorts of climate mechanisms. One part of the research windfall that has resulted from this concentration on climate mechanisms has been an enormous increase in the sophistication of scientific understandings of past weather. For historians, this is manifesting in a wealth of information, unlike anything that has existed before, and two fields in particular, each with their own complementary strengths, have jumped into view. And those two fields are A, paleoclimatology, and B, historical climatology, right? And there are, while they share the designation climatology, the distinction really is a distinction that bases itself on the source material that these two use. Very helpfully, this is sort of well put together in what is the first sort of major textbook of historical climatology, which is the Palgrave Handbook of Climate History. And it's a very interesting book, but among other things, it points to the fact that historians who are getting interested in this field, in climate history, are using either archives of nature, and there's ingenious stuff that's happening. These are all proxy ways of trying to understand the weather via tree rings, via pollen, pollen depositions and so on, via snow, via algae bloom, via all kinds of really, really fascinating things and really, really great detective work. And the other kind of thing that climate history is employing are the archives of societies. And this includes instrumental records, diaries, artworks, harvest records, something that looks quite a lot more familiar to historians. And this field of climate history is starting to intertwine these in some very, very interesting ways. Broadly speaking, the archives of nature tend to be treated as far more reliable. Right? However, the archives of nature often don't have the level of resolution and detail, either in time or in space, for it to be really useful for historians. And as a result of this, actually, the archives of society really spring into action here. And in fact, in some instances, the archives of society, instrumental records, China is actually a wonderful example of this, as I will talk about in a few minutes, where particular records are actually so meticulously and have been so meticulously kept that they're actually helping to inform reconstructions of past, particularly at the smaller resolutions that start to make things interesting for climatologists more generally, right? So the archives of society, in fact, have become, in some few instances at least, ways of actually refining and developing climate science itself. For historians, the archives of society and the archives of nature being brought together in this way, where the broad scale, broad sweep understandings that the archives of nature can present, the scientific rigor that is now available here is unparalleled in the past, from past sort of versions of this, compared to this question of the archives of society. But the archives of society are really giving us so much of interest that the application of these methods has emerged. One, the most developed application of these methods has been to periods of history from the 18th century and earlier. The 17th century, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, has a particularly important place in this. Second, when applied to more recent periods, it is often applied, this kind of a paradigm of climate history is often applied to places like the Antarctic and the Arctic, where human habitation tends to be sparse. And it's interesting to take note of this, that in many ways, climate history is not, has not really burgeoned for 19th, 20th century, 21st century, and has not really burgeoned for sort of areas of large amounts of human habitation. Now, the classic in the field of climate history, and climate history, the big break that it is sort of making with the past is really that it wants to talk much more about climate and causation. And in doing so, it's sort of breaking away from a kind of historiographical taboo where climate is not understood to cause things. And that historiographical taboo is being broken in this current moment as climate is clearly beginning to cause social phenomena. And interest in this sort of way of thinking about the causative effect of climate has grown tremendously. And the classic in this field is Jeffrey Parker's General Crisis. It's a classic in the sense that it's old. It's also a classic in the sense perhaps that it has been transcended. But it's a nice sort of entry point in that sense, which is that it's an update of a series of debates that happened. Eric Hobsbawm was very prominent in these debates in the 1950s about the breakdown in social structures that happened in Europe around the 17th century. The earlier debate was centered on Europe, and the earlier debate coalesced around the question, sharply posed by Hobsbawm, of the 17th century crisis being evidence of the emergence of capitalist relationships in the, and setting aside of the ancien regime. That was the original version of the 17th century crisis. In the new version, that emphasis on capitalism is gone, and instead, it's the Little Ice Age. It's what's called the Little Ice Age, which is placed in that causative spot, right? What is it that's causing this general crisis across the globe? It is the Little Ice Age. Now, a little bit of a sort of deviation from academic history to talk a little bit about what is this Little Ice Age. And the Little Ice Age is a reference to, it's a slightly lower average temperature, a slight deviation from average temperature, ranging up to about 0.8 degrees Celsius, not really as much as 1 degree Celsius, cooler, right? In a period that stretches from about mid 1400s till about the end of the 19th century, right? This whole period is broadly called the Ice Age, which was decisively cooler than the medieval warm period. This is all well attested to in the paleoclimatology records and so on. And speculation about the causes seems to indicate that it's volcanic activity in the first place, but also for a crucial time period from 1645 till 1715, so right in the center of that 17th century period. Those 70 years, there's evidence for reduced solar activity. It's what's called the Maunder minimum, right? And over the 17th century, from 1600 onwards, you can see even in this graph, you get these much cooler temperatures, of course, with variations and so on. But you get these much cooler temperatures, of which that period from 1640s onwards till 1715 is among the coldest. And this really lies at the heart of Parker's reconstruction of the general crisis that I was mentioning of the 17th century. And what he says happens in a number of societies across the world, in England, Germany, Spain, France, so far so European, but also the Ottoman Empire, also China. In many cases, Mexico is also increasingly now being drawn into this discussion of the Little Ice Age of the 17th century and so on. And what's happening in all of these places is older weather patterns are destabilized. Very crucially, that leads to a disruption of agriculture. Agriculture is a very crucial sort of intermediary, and that leads to famines, epidemics, rebellions, war, and, for instance, in the case of China, the overthrow of massive dynasties, right? Nearly the entire 18th century is taken up in China, 17th century is taken up by China in China by wars relating to the sweeping away of one of the mighty dynasties anywhere in the world at that time, the Ming dynasty, which is replaced by what had hitherto been a much more tribally organized, that is to say, much more kinship-based relationship and so on, sort of area from the northeast, the area that is marked out as Manchuria. It's replaced by the Manchus and the Qings, and they sweep down across and become the rulers of inland China over the course of the 17th century. And what Parker sort of shows is that there's a huge loss in population over this period. There's lots of war, lots of dislocation, famines, the crucial sort of canal that links the two rivers that you're seeing there, the Yellow and the Yangtze. That canal goes dry for 1 year. It's quite a sort of unique happening, and so on. Now, Parker's overarching thesis is confused and sometimes fails on many counts to constitute a global crisis. India, for instance, escapes, Japan escapes. These are all examples actually that Parker does discuss. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But the broad historiographical sort of consensus seems to be that this 17th century global aspect of this crisis doesn't seem to hold up very well. Climate simply doesn't play the same kind of role in generating the idea of crisis as some of the other societies. But what you have seen is that in the wake of Parker, you've got much more sophisticated hypotheses that are much better grounded in trying to prove that thing that I was saying was crucial to climate history, which is trying to prove causation as a result of climate, right? And and this has been linked to many things as sort of broad as, but they're specific, but there's a number of them. There's quite a wide range of them. This includes things like the settler colonial enterprise into the Americas in the 17th century, pastoral rebellions of many sorts, the witch trials of early modern Europe, and others. There's been sort of very interesting literature around how climate was responsible for some of these things. And in each of these instances, what you're starting to find is a much bolder use of climate as causing thing in human societies. And this is an interesting, as I mentioned, this is an interesting sort of new conjuncture. What should we make of climate history? which is a thread that I'm certain is actually going to be of increasing importance in the coming years. This more than anything else, this is the sort of big boost. The first big boost that any area of history has received has been climate history. And really the crucial thing that this scholarship seems to be reasserting is the importance of material factors in human activity. Crop failures, storms, inhospitable climates, and their impacts when those material factors are refracted through the variety of social structures that are found in human societies throughout history. So that these material factors have a decisive impact is one very, very crucial insight that this climate history is really very boldly sort of now increasingly confident in presenting. From this, a second generalization of this literature can be made, which is that almost invariably, if we're thinking about the impact of climate on societies, invariably in these cases, the poor and the socially disadvantaged suffer the most, even though elite structures can also often be shaken up. And this is one thing that, of course, we're finding in study after study of these sort of historical transformations of climate. In the case of the Little Ice Age, just a slight decrease in the temperature rather than increase in temperature. In my opinion, the return to material is entirely to be welcomed. A truly critical historical practice for this period, I think, will return to a scientific realism and away from the more flamboyant forms of social constructivism, I think. There is, to my mind, a second danger of the new materialisms, but we can discuss that if you like in the Q&A. But I think that this sort of assertion of the material is quite important, interesting, and crucial, I think, for this moment more generally. But, and here another but follows, can climate history be the defining advance in the discipline of academic history? And towards this end, the brilliant historian Andreas Malm actually points to a crucial blind spot of climate history, of the climate literature, which is evident even in the many statements of its practitioners, who, as I mentioned, are doing innovative and really fascinating work. And this is well encapsulated in this really interesting discussion, the distinction that he makes between climate in history. And he says the first sort of response to the current moment has been to really excavate climate in history, right? Climate in history is really the impact of climate on human societies in pre-modern times. And partly this is always going to remain the case, that it'll be a one-way causation here, climate to society, precisely because this is a literature that's emerging rooted in the science of paleoclimatology. And that science seems to indicate increasingly, an increasingly strong consensus, that pre-modern forms of human activity did not, except in localized instances, generate massive transformations in climate. So climate in history. The watchword of climate in history is really, these are great lessons in adaptations, in how human societies are adapting, changing, transformed, in resilience. But of course, the climate crisis represents the opposite. It represents the impact of human activity in transforming the climate. That's what's happening in the climate crisis. As Malm puts it, I think, well, it's not a question of climate in history, but in fact, what historians must do to make a critical contribution to movements as they try to resist climate change is to talk about history in climate. Right? How is it that human societies, as they have been changing, have come to transform the climate? Right? And in contrast to much of climate history that I outlined before, this will necessarily be a modern history. Right? The geologists even agree on this. But more profoundly, the nature of the climate crisis means that it might not even be an environmental history at all. If we're talking about history in climate, we might not even be talking about the realm of environmental history. Because as he's pointing out, the peculiarity of the climate crisis is that though it is manifested in the atmosphere and though it destroys the environment, it is not the atmosphere or the environment which is generating the problem. The science, in short, holds partial and inadequate clues to the origins of the climate crisis. I think this is a really, really important insight, and I think his following through on this is also really an excellent example of what historians can do. And I'd highly recommend that everybody go out and read Fossil Capital, the book that I'm going to sort of talk about for the rest of these next 5-7 minutes. Is that how much time I have, Prabhu?
Yeah, that's good.
Oh. Yeah, okay.
10 minutes is good.
So Malm's response has been to meticulously reconstruct the emergence of what he calls the fossil economy. Fossil economy, fossil capital, to my mind, is a key concept that ought to become a standard element in the conceptual toolkit of the Anthropocene citizen. Right? Whether you're a scholar or an activist, this is a concept that should be in everyone's toolkit. And what he's talking about is that a simple definition would be an economy of self-sustaining growth predicated on the growing consumption of fossil fuels, and therefore generating a sustained growth in emissions of carbon dioxide. Right? That's what he calls fossil capital. If you like the sort of common sense way of thinking about it, not a mystery or anything, not something sort of radically new, but really important, I think, is the concept of fossil fuels and capitalism. This pattern of self-sustaining growth being another way of sort of describing capitalism. So at its core is an energy system, consumption of fossil fuels, and an economic system. And it's the hitching of these two together that is the key moment for our contemporary crisis. Right? And here, actually, the timing is probably not in doubt. Almost everyone agrees that it was the Industrial Revolution where economic growth and fossil fuels were hitched together. The canonical accounts of the Industrial Revolution, however, are written under the sign of either Ricardo or Malthus, Smith, or all three of them, or both of them, or some combination of them. All sort of venerable political economists. Here's how the story sort of broadly goes. In terms of energy, the key shift is a shift from the organic economy, and the organic economy is one that depends ultimately upon the annual solar power that is taken up for photosynthesis by plants. That solar power which is taken up by plants becomes food for animals and humans, as well as wood for burning. Right? So this solar inflow that is reaching an economy in a year is the barrier. It's the natural barrier. Right? Pre-industrial organic economies cannot expand beyond that metabolism, according to this way of looking at things. What happens in the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and the 19th, that sunshine which has been buried, millions of years of sunshine, in the form of fossil fuels, millions of years of fossil fuels, which are after all organic matter which has been compressed, so on. That's what changes in the 18th century. And you get this shift to a mineral economy from an organic economy. And that's where you have the basis for a truly momentous increase in human productivity. The climate crisis is the unfortunate side effect of this breaking of the limits on organic economy. So in this narrative, scarcity of land on which fuel wood could be grown and barriers to population growth are the spurs to innovation, which leads to the fossil fuel economy emerging. Especially when, and in some versions, it's a happy accident that in England, British coal is readily accessible to British cities, right? So the spur ultimately is to break past the limits of the organic economy. And the lucky thing is this presence of coal. Malm disagrees with this account, and he thinks this account is dangerous, it's incorrect, and he disagrees with the Ricardian and Malthusian, Malthus because of population, Ricardian because of land and its limitations. He disagrees with this idea, and he also conducts in the process some of the lazier but no less common assumptions, that it's either superior power of coal or the superior efficiency of coal that leads to its rise. It's neither superior power of coal nor the superior efficiency of coal that leads to the creation of fossil economy in Malm's fascinating account. It's none of these factors. It's not a land scarcity, it's not a population explosion, it's none of these things. The shift to coal happened for quite other reasons. And his story really concentrates on a subcategory, but a crucial subcategory, a subcategory of the fossil economy, right? Which is that question of exploding growth, self-sustaining growth. And the first commodity that demonstrates that is cotton. No commodity demonstrates that in quite that way up until much, much later. Explosion towards growth happens first in cotton, and uniquely in cotton, actually. And so cotton and its industrial takeoff is seen for Malm's narration of this energy transition. And what looking carefully at cotton forced to do is actually to ask a very, very strange question, perhaps an counterintuitive question. Why did actually coal come to the cotton industry so late? 1784 famously is when Watt's engine is created. It is quite clear that until the 1830s or 1820s, 1825 to 1835, steam and coal cannot outcompete the water wheel. And it is in fact the water wheel which is the mainstay of that first cotton takeoff, which, as you can see, is happening in the late 18th century, right? What Malm shows is that water, even at the point at which it's replaced in the 1820s and 1830s, is cheaper than coal. It's at least as, if not more efficient than coal, right? And there's no scarcity of water resources in England at the point of time at which people start to shift to coal in the cotton industry. So why then this shift? And what he demonstrates is that it was the shift to coal happens not because of the efficiency of the fuel, not because of anything else. It happens because you have the first economic crisis of the cotton boom, which hits at about 1825. And the second factor emerges. And as a result of, for instance, winning the 10-hour day in the 1840s, it puts the last nail into the coffin of the water wheel. Economic crisis, a new cycle of industrial time, and the growing strength of labor all threatened the cotton industry where it hurt the most, at its bottom line. And the response of the cotton industry was to intensify production and to try to locate that production in places where labor supply is abundant. And those places are cities. It's the shift to the cities of England is completed. And the only way in which you can fuel a cotton industry in the cities of England, the only way in which you can have that flexibility of place, that flexibility of time, was through coal. In short, what is Malm saying? Malm is saying that coal was discovered by capitalists looking to restore profits and discipline labor. It was the key weapon in that process. In short, the fossil economy was born in the heat of class struggle and was a direct outcome of the victory of the capitalist class in that class struggle in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Right? So it's not inherent technical superiority. It's not a whole bunch of things. In fact, part of what Malm uncovers is that the early forms of machine breaking really represent, in a certain sense, in an implicit sense, not in an explicit sense, an form of environmental action that perhaps we can all learn from, in physically arresting the fossil economy, and in a variety of other ways. In fact, working class culture of that time has coal not as what the bosses are presenting coal as. The bosses are erecting statues of Watt, of James Watt, in the 1820s, before coal is even the dominant, before the steam engine is even the dominant way of producing things in the economy. It already has decided that this is the guy. At that same period of time, workers are talking about how coal is enslaving them, and so on and so on. Right? So Malm's account has a lot of richness, but the core of his message is a investigate that historians must turn a renewed, harsh, and unremitting light on the key mechanisms that are driving the climate crisis. Crisis is a creation of and an outcome of the interests of the powerful. Historians who want to put their shoulder to the wheel in this effort to stop the climate crisis must lay bare those structures of power. A history for the environment in this moment will not necessarily be an environmental history. Right? So climate and history and climate. There are within these, of course, numerous other threads that I've not had time to get into. Most notably, Renaissance in histories of concepts and ideas through which both climate and climate change have been addressed, have been experienced by people. In this field, there's also a from below aspect. In this history of ideas and intellectual history, there's a from below aspect as well as a from above aspect. Both about attitudes and conceptions through which ordinary people have understood their climate, as well as how expert knowledge and international negotiations have unfolded. But let me sum up by trying to state some of the key moves that I think have happened in this historiographical survey. First, that there is a clear space for an integration of scientific data into historical work. And I think it's proving actually very, very fruitful. Second, that some literature of history, climate in history, is helping to refine scientific knowledge, or is contributing to our sense of the climate crisis by really talking to us about adaptation, resilience, modes in which human beings have shaped and reshaped their societies in the mold of, when subjected to disasters or broad shifts in climate patterns. But particularly, finally, for modern historians, we should also be thinking about history in climate. That histories for climate change need not be climate histories or environmental histories. We need climate change questions to inflect our studies more generally. All of our classic themes, structure, agency, some of the things that Prabhu talked about at the top of this, are crucial, vital, important. And what's important for us as historians researching in this moment is to really start to disseminate and think much more carefully about how a variety of our fields can relate to the climate crisis. This will require some of those moves that climate and history is doing, but also a lot more of reframing some of the things that we've already been talking about. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll take questions because I think I've gone on for about 40 minutes, and we can, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Anish. It's yeah, is it that we're getting some questions? So before some of these questions, there are some clarificatory questions. There's a question from Lavanya. I think it's important. What you have asked or you have pointed out was the idea of new materialism. And I think from what I could make out from your talk, and Lavanya is asking that, can you expand on this question, on the theme of new materialism? You said it is a good thing, but you also pointed out to its limitations. Huh? How is this new materialism an interesting concept? That's one. And as you look at this question, may I just add on or something? And as others ask this question, it's very important. But maybe you can discuss it at a later thing. Is a way in which you did not at all address the central question raised by Dipesh Chakrabarty. He was one of the early historians actually to look at Anthropocene and the climate change and at a much deeper level, not as a causative or a agential question, but as the question of the possibility of history itself. Insofar history is a human activity. And so when you ask this question that, or at least provocatively ask this question that instead of doing a climate in history, or not just instead, we must bring in climate in history, but what's crucial is history in climate. That means get the historical structures right. So there, I think it's important that, so I was wondering, how would you respond to this, the broader question about, at least you would not, as a historian, not believe that people do certain things and there is a counter finality involved. What you do, what is called unintended consequences, but things like what you do can turn back against you. And human history has been shaped by a lot of this counter final things, that you do have some intention and all, and it comes back. And so I was just wondering, would you just expand on these two questions, the limit or the question on new materialism, as well as and what I asked you basically about your take on Dipesh is, I'm sure you know about it, yeah.
Please, before you do, Anish, please stop your screen share, Anish. This is Naga.
Should I stop my screen share?
Unless you need it.
I don't think I need it. I mean, I can always switch it on as and when needed.
There was a request that you stop. Yeah, please, sorry.
So just begin from these two quickly. These two, and there are some more questions coming.
Sorry, things keep breaking up, but from what I can tell, are the two questions that have been posed just now. One is the question of new materialism. The other is the question of Dipesh Chakrabarty. Let me take Prabhu, you mentioned the question of sort of unintended consequences and things like that, and really that goes to new materialism in some ways, I think. So I'm going to take that portion of it here, but I'll talk about Dipesh Chakrabarty a bit sort of separately and after that. So new materialism broadly sort of refers to a series of approaches that are trying to think about in a major way, usually tend to talk about actors, about the fact that material things of all sorts have impacts and shape and reshape all the things that they act in, right? That's why sort of one of the major ways of thinking about talks about actor network theory, where humans are simply one type of material actor in a series of other, that is situated among a series of other kinds of actors that have as much, if not more, agency, and so on. So broadly, that's sort of one very, very important, well understood current within new materialism. There are a few others as well take a slightly different tack, but more or less they're all interested in, if you like, rethinking the question of agency. That's, if you like, a very, very fundamental question of this new materialism. You'll have the agency of animals talked about. So the mosquito causes ABC. Yeah. You'll have the agency of things talked about. This building causes this, or so on. To my mind, this is a dead end. To my mind, frankly, this is the moment where this line of thinking has either been is either useful or actually was ever accurate. Right? Let me say a little bit about why. I think the most sort of compelling counter response that I've read has again come from Andreas Malm. The second book of his that I'd recommend is Progress of the Storm, which to my mind has a decisive refutation of a lot of the new materialist thinking. He's also entertaining and writer. It's very enjoyable for that reason as well. Well, it's this, which is that this moment, if you like, and I'm going to answer it largely on the basis of, I'm not going to go into a sort of philosophical account of this. I'm going to answer it in the vein of a sort of practical program that we're talking about here. I'm happy to talk about the philosophy of it if you'd like me to get into it, but which is that this is the moment where we have to be much, much more discriminating and careful about how and where we identify agency. Not the moment where one messy soup, right? This is the moment where it's become quite clear that human beings are causing climate change. There are various natural phenomena that amplify that generate the feedback loops, that generate the different forms of sort of tipping points and so on that we've talked about, but they aren't causing it. They are not the agents. Let's be very clear. If thinking about agency is our limit form, because of course, any other notion of agency, and various versions of this have been found among the new materialists, lays down their arms before, or like Bruno Latour, actually ties itself into knots when trying to answer the question of why should we take climate change seriously. And so to my mind, in fact, climate change is the moment where in fact our account of agency as, you know, human, as different for being human. And in fact, more than that, more than just being human, being social, which is another thing that new materialists actually bypass altogether. Being social and situated within social relations is more urgent than ever before. And new materialism strikes me as a form of thinking about theory, which is not just a dead end, it's actually a dangerous dead end to my mind. So, I mean, that's my position. But what I'd say, which is that it's preferable to have this materialism than the thoroughgoing constructivism. It is also telling that some of the constructivists are also the new materialists, but that's a whole different question. About Deepesh Chakrabarti, and I've read his work. I've read in preparation for this, I wanted to read his book, which I bought, but I've read all his articles before for the course, and as well as right now again, and so on. And actually, Deepesh Chakrabarti's work strikes me as falling to some of these same problems. For instance, his championing of deep history at a moment where I think deep history is not actually a way of trying to understand the climate crisis or understanding what's happening. His call for species level thinking is, to my mind, deeply disarming as a way of trying to think about as a way of trying to think about crisis. Perhaps the moment was unguarded, perhaps not, but in one of those essays, he talks about how there are no lifeboats for the rich in the current climate crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least for the time being, in a temporary sense, there are lifeboats for the rich, and that's part of the reason why the climate crisis is not taken seriously. And I think Deepesh Chakrabarti is it's a deeply dangerous sort of sidetrack in the emerging historiography around climate change. I don't think we should be following in his tracks. Now, some of the things that he's talked about, the need for coming together of science and history in some ways, is happening, but actually it's happening in ways that he's not talking about. He's actually talking about all the wrong ways in which it's happening, in a certain sense. And I just think his compass is all wrong. I don't think that's a very, very.
I'm sorry. It's I didn't want you to give a full-scale opinion about considered. Just to kind of say that he was one of the first historians to kind of take it on, the question of climate change and questioning the discipline of history itself in terms of its aim and all. That's that's about all. I wasn't looking at the specific ways he has done it. So good that you have said. So now there's a set of questions, and let me just point out the questions which are which would be one set are more linked to your questions about how you presented this question of the major shift with industrial revolution around questions of cotton and so on and so forth, and broadly around that, and a set of other questions which are much more about politics and climate change, politics and historians' role, which is something which you alluded to, but there are some questions around. So let me just take you some of the specific questions. So like Mayank is asking thanking you for going beyond coal and steel, that's good. But how will you place the independence of USA and the revenue from India in the, I suppose he means in the question of takeoff. That means 1776 and so-called drain of wealth in the early period. He's asking that. Are they more important in so far compared to coal versus, your question was coal versus water, but how would you locate in the question of coal versus water these two aspects, you know, independence of USA and revenue from India? That means drain of wealth. There is some other questions around how far do you think colonialism actually was responsible for this major climate change, or how do you locate this is by VG, I think, Vidya, I'm not sure. How do you think that colonialists affected the climate of India? This is India, though you didn't talk much about India, climate of India for their own profit. Vidushi God, I think this is one of the questions she asked. The other one is from Anirudh, who asked about the fact that coal was available the year around because of increased mining from the late 18th century, whereas supply of water was dependent on weather. And to process and sell cotton on an increasing scale in the context of an expanding empire in the 19th century, the increasing use of cotton, of coal, I think he means, may have important causes located outside the class struggle. So Anirudh is asking, maybe your firm location or Malm's firm location of this shift in class struggle, maybe there are some factors beyond class struggle. So maybe 24-hour, you know, sunlight being there for 12 hours or 6, that is important limitations. Could water have powered the large cotton mills which arose in Lancashire in the 19th century? So this is his kind of a supposed clinching question. So this is a set of questions around importance of particular causations, whether technology or social relations, that you have posited. So if you can answer that, yeah.
I'm going to take them in reverse, sorry, because the question of colonialism, Mam hasn't written his book, but on the question of these questions that Anirudh has raised, Mam's book actually does answer them. So, okay, coal being present all the year round, but water, of course, is, you know, it can vary, especially in summers. You can have times when, in the case of England, in the summers, you can have time periods when the flow of water is not enough, and so on, and you can have droughts, and those cause various difficulties. Yes, absolutely right. But those are already baked into the competition. They were always baked into the competition, as you're talking about. As you're quite correctly pointing out, the coal supply has been what it was from 18th century onwards, sort of early mid 18th century onwards. The water supply is also just what it was. The fact that water could successfully compete against coal in the late 18th century, a direct outcome of the workarounds that the capitalists had found. Right? And those workarounds were actually things like water mills had this tradition that when water went down, when water reduced, obviously the mills stopped. But they would make up for that by actually forcing us to work extra shifts, much longer hours, much longer periods of time on other times when water was available. And of course, that is available all the year through. Coal, you must remember at this point of time, is actually extremely expensive. It takes a lot of money to actually ship coal from the coal mines to the factories where they're located. So actually that competition is very, very successfully carried out by water. And is capable of being successfully carried out by water even into the 1820s and 30s, right? So this year-round thing is not so much of a problem. The question of supplying the expanding empire and could it have powered the large cotton mills? It's an interesting hypothetical, but perhaps the wrong one. I suppose the wrong one, right? The expanding empire is really, and the expanding market and the need to supply an expanding market is one of the conditions, of course, under which this shift is carrying out. Of course, it's related to that growth of self-sustaining economy. It's exactly what Mom is describing. That is exactly what's happening. This is, in fact, one of the pressures which is growing from the 19th century. And in order to get those profits is precisely why capitalists are ramping up their production and moving towards coal. It's not because of coal's inherent properties or technical superiority or any of this, or scarcity of coal or scarcity of water. It's not those things. It is something else. It's a capitalist dynamic that is causing it. Could it have powered the large cotton mills? Might not have been able to. This is beside the point. At the point in which you actually see the shift from water to coal, the largest forms of production are entirely possible with water. This is not a problem. In fact, what shifts this? This is where the 10-hour day actually plays a very, very important role that Mom points out. The 10-hour day takes away from the water wheel what the water wheel relied on. Exactly what you pointed to, right? Water is available year-round. Water not being available year-round means that you have to make workers work extra hours, you have to make workers work extra days. It's when the 10-hour day interrupts that there is no option but to shift to coal. And the 10-hour day is won by workers fighting. It's actually exactly the terrain of class struggle that the 10-hour day comes to shift the time pattern of accumulation away from where water can become viable. And that shift is not because of, again, technical questions or the cheapness of stuff. It's because of class struggle. The other side of this, of course, is that in a number of other places, France and the US, very, very large industrial takeoffs seem to be possible with water for a very, very long time, actually. The US doesn't have a dominance of coal until much, much later. And France continues till a very, very long time. Are they capable of doing this? Yeah, there are some fairly significant industrial takeoffs that can even happen with water. Perhaps not in England, perhaps not. It's the question of what are the social relations that surround it, and what do the capitalists do, and what do workers do in those situations and circumstances. The picture should be concentrated. Okay, to the questions of colonialism. So Mayank's question, as well as, I'm not sure, I didn't catch whose question that was.
Vidushi God.
About colonialism and the climate of India. Interrelated questions, but perhaps pulling in different directions. Mayank, I have some naughty thoughts about the drain of wealth, which I don't sort of get into. The general point being, in a certain sense, the question that we're posing here is quite a well delineated one. Where did the fossil economy come from? And what Mom, I think, very compellingly demonstrates is that, so here's the pattern of emphasis maybe that you and a number of others would find disconcerting here. It puts England in the center of the world story in the invention of the fossil economy. And that, if you like, is an interesting shift. It's not a new shift. It's in a sense a return to an old historiographic shift, way of thinking about it. Is it true or not? Is really the question that we have to think about. Is there a viable other candidate? You know, even the conventional histories of the Industrial Revolution or of the fossil economy will not say that this shift happened in Netherlands or anywhere else. If we're looking at where coal is being consumed and being linked to this expanding economy, and it's very clearly after the 1830s, 40s linked to that, and it very quickly goes into iron, steel, other areas. The steam engine really picks up. In fact, a different design of the steam engine than war. So I'm not sure what is doing in all of this. But anyway, it's really fascinating to think. So if we're thinking globally now, the Industrial Revolution, global, there are various different places where it was carried out. Interesting proposition. But the fossil economy, there is a clear homeland. That homeland is it accounts for, if I'm not mistaken, there's a statistic about it. Up till 1860, it accounts for like 60% of the globe's consumption of coal. It only goes to under half by about the 1880s, 1890s. So, you know, England is heartland. England is this heartland. And the heartland of this heartland, because remember, actually, one of the things that I didn't get into because it's in the details, is that coal usage is not, coal usage for cotton is not the main usage of coal. Right? It's a very specific link that Mom is making. He's making it between fossil fuels and the dynamic economy. This link between profit and coal. That's the thing that's emerging in the context of this class. And it's a really interesting aspect. So in a certain sense, the independence of the breaking away of the USA and the breaking away of and the question of drain of wealth from India. How do they contribute to this story? The best case scenarios for these events, you're talking about colonial wealth, set up some of these industries and flowing into some of the wealth. The point that's being made here is it's not a simple increase in wealth that leads to the shift to the fossil economy. It's actually struggle and the particular social political configurations that are coming about. These laws that are being enacted as a result of the struggles that are happening. That leads to the first fateful connection between these two elements in actual historical terms. About colonialism in India, absolutely right, Vidushi. We need to develop more material on this. To my mind, one part of this story is going to be coal, sort of this systematic tapping of coal, initially from Eastern India, later on from some other parts of the country. It's initiated by the British and organized in conjunction with sort of Indian entrepreneurs. One of Tagore's ancestors is a very, very big coal industrialist and so on, with colonialism. So that fossil fuel aspect of it is very critical. My instinct, however, is that given the amount of industrialization, given the amount of coal consumption that happens during the colonial period, it might well be that other aspects of colonialism are more significant as contributors to climate change than is coal in the Indian case. So I suspect that we'd have to think much more carefully. Actually, a lot of this work has been done. The question is to connect it to climate change and so on. To think about land use shifts and to think about forests and the ways in which they've been changed and shifted and so on, might be more significant if we're thinking about India's contribution to this thing, which of course globally one must remember is throughout this period of time comparatively little. There's hardly anything in global terms that India is it exploitative in the most? Sorry, just the last point. Of course, it's exploitative of workers, and there's a scene of there. There's a scene of the fact that fossil economies are deeply exploitative and deeply unequal and deeply involved in the suppression of that story. Yes, we should definitely be investigating that. More people are doing it.
Anish, this is just a linked question from Nagaraj is asking you linked question about insofar as the question of coal.
Sorry,
is that
Prabhu, you dropped out for a minute. Yeah, hello, I can hear you now.
Okay, so it's about Naga's question which is a link to what Anirudh had asked earlier. That is it that the advantage of coal lay in somewhere in being available could be transported anywhere, unlike water. So he's actually channeling a later version of why railways came in, how they created. So water was a limitation in his argument that maybe coal, because it could be, of course, coal was transported across water in huge barges across the canals. So, but that apart, he's saying the fact that water, the transportation of coal would have been a natural advantage vis-a-vis water as a source of energy. Would you like to quickly answer that if you have this? And
Um,
so,
No, absolutely. The transportation of coal is critical because it allows for the capitalist to be located anywhere, the factory to be located anywhere. And why the factory should be located in a city is because there's lots of workers, which means workers are competing against each other, which means that in a situation where they are able to sort of bargain down wages, this can be accomplished. In the case of water, you have to have your factory located in remote places, comparatively remote places. You have to think about how to get your labor there and so on. And those are just different structures of cost that are related to these two technologies. The point is, of course, that the shift from the one structure to the other structure happens in a very particular context. One structure being better than the other structure happens in a very particular context. The general point that, in fact, capitalists look to break out of the natural limit is a diagnostic point that has to be captured and is repeated constantly. That they need to break the natural place nature of the water. That's very critical.
right. So there's just two sets of questions, and we have actually we have 15 minutes or 20 minutes actually before we end. So I'm going to put out the questions which are one set of questions is more political, and I will in the sense contemporary political. I think Praveen Gupta asked that how do you what do you think of no, he put it very pithily. Trump calls climate changers communists. Do you think it's all loose talk, or may I just a second?
Sorry, who are communists? Climate change are communists, or communists are not climate changes? Is that the question? Like, am I implying that?
No, you're not implying. He's saying. Sorry, just a second. This keeps moving. Praveen, Trump calls climate activists communists. Is it loose talk or something deeper in context of what you just alluded? Capitalism winning and arrival of coal, fossil fuel. That means the question, the larger question of social relations and class struggle, which was crucial for this shift of technology. How do you link it to what's happening today? That's I suppose what he's asking when Trump is calling climate changers as communists. And so is it something loose talk or something deeper? There's something else alongside about, again, Vidushi asking whether, what is your insight on the nuclear power used in Japan during the Second World War? The nuclear power wasn't used in Japan. Maybe she means something else. Or nuclear bomb, or I don't know, nuclear power used in Japan during the Second World War? No. I think related to climate. But I think broader questions he's asking is nuclear power. I hope it's not nuclear bomb, but it's nuclear power related to climate change. If you can, these two quickly, if you can answer this question of there is another set of questions which are a little more about the questions of agency, about nature versus social relations, which I think need to be taken together and answered. So just quickly on these questions of politics and
I'm going to dodge the question on nuclear power and climate change. I have a personal opinion. It's not well enough grounded. There are people here, perhaps, I don't know if Ramana is here, like he should step in and talk about this, but nuclear power has been a disaster and is not the direction in which we should be going in trying to transcend sort of the climate change question. I have some sense of this literature. Others will have a better sense of this literature. Okay, the question of systemic change and climate change. Is Trump right to identify that everybody who opposes climate change is in fact asking for a form of socialism? Much as I hate it, I think there is an insight there for Trump's, which is that, look, the basic point here is we don't have time to wait for a communist or any other revolution to fix this problem. It just is not going to happen. However, the converse is also true, or whatever. Another version of this is also true. There's a qualification to be added here. So it's not as if communism or socialism can afford to be the necessary precondition for solving the climate change problem. We have to solve it here, now, today. Is it possible? So a different way of asking this question, is it possible to do this without shifting social relationships in some serious fashion? I think that's what Trump is latching on to. So I think the answer is no. I don't think we can shift towards a serious addressing of the climate change question without shifting social relations in a serious way. If you like, the insight which is held in Malm's account of the energy transition is that technical superiority or potential for superior power does not actually shift from one technology to the other. It has to be class struggle in various ways. It has to win. It has to be social struggle that wins the transition. And without building larger movements, without sort of engaging with this question of social conflict more frontally, we're not going to be able to think seriously about this and build it in a certain direction. Otherwise, we'll find even more of the Deepesh Chakravarti's lifeboats for the rich arriving. So yeah, so I don't think we're going to be able to solve the climate catastrophe without a serious, at least some serious way of trying to address existing forms of social and taking them on and defeating quite simply.
Okay, so there are the set of questions around this broader. So Sharad Lele's question is, would you say that while giving nature too much agency or any agency is dangerously, while it is dangerously distracting, the idea of unintended consequence of human action is a useful idea. That means, yeah, without causing something, without being, so no,
a notion
just
of
a second.
A notion of agency that says that it
just a
be
second.
intended
Sorry, just one more thing. Rajeshwari is asking, you highlight the relationship between technological choices and capitalism, but can history in climate also address our concerns about the technician and the bureaucrat who dominate our understanding? We know that both the capitalist and commissars are deeply invested in fossil economy. So that was actually a little, should have been connected to the earlier question in some sense. But this Vandana has I think a deeper question linked directly to this nature versus or whatever agential aspect of nature. I think it is dangerous, she says, to assume that nature has no agency whatsoever. Perhaps I am biased as a physicist, according to her. Surely it is possible to admit agency of nature for instances of climate change before humans showed on the earth. Wow, okay. Without diluting the fact that current climate change is caused by humans, some humans. Besides even current climate change, if natural cycles went going slowly towards global cooling, we would have, we would have worse global climate or whatever. I'm sorry, I can't read it just now. So basically, she's asking you the question, do you have to dump the question of agential aspect of nature altogether in order to say that human beings have caused it, or some human beings have caused it? So in other words, climate change is a combination of anthropogenic and natural factors, with natural factors acting as a brake on human ones. So here, it's I think both these questions, Sharad Lele and Vandana's questions, are about what weight would you give nature, natural agential aspect of nature, in understanding both and agential aspect of nature in relation to human. Yeah.
Okay. Let me take. I agree. Sorry, I didn't think that Sharad Lele's question and Vandana's question were the same. My sense of Sharad Lele's question was the question about unintended consequences. A notion of agency which insists that the agent must know every single aspect of their action and all the consequences is to really make it a straw man, straw person, whatever. It's not a compelling account of agency. So of course, unintended consequences will exist. However, to my mind, actually, what Vandana is saying underlines the importance of what we lose when we attribute agency to nature, right? Because the question to ask yourself, Vandana, with respect to the mechanisms that you're talking about, could nature have chosen to do otherwise? Could the natural forces that you're talking about, without humans in the picture, have acted in some physically different way out of some choice of nature? And the answer quite simply is no. And if our account of agency is letting go of this, or is saying that this question is irrelevant, right? Is saying that this question of could they choose to do otherwise is irrelevant, we are losing a tremendous amount, including in our understanding of human agency, because that is always on the table with respect to human agency. Could they have chosen to do otherwise? That is the whole peg of our climate movement, right? If we follow a notion that these two forms of agency must be seen as exactly the same, we fall into, I think, exactly losing out on what we need from an account, a theoretical account of agency. What we need from a theoretical account of agency is some idea of intentionality, not a perfect, to go back to the question that we first asked, is not a question of agency which says that everybody must know exactly about all of the consequences that they're doing, but have some idea and can therefore choose to do differently, is a notion of agency. And that simply isn't true for any notion of nature's agency that you could talk. You can't talk about the Ganga choosing to flow differently out of this thing. The ways in which the Ganga's flow shifts, which it does, of course, which has huge impacts on many things, has nothing to do with Ganga's intention. It has to do with tectonic shifts. It has to do with drainages. It has to do with a whole lot of physical phenomena that the Ganga can't choose to do otherwise. So, I think, Vandana, the point that you're making actually underlines precisely if we talk about nature having agency. And to my mind, it's quite a crucial element. So, of course, nature has effects, and I completely agree with your formulation: anthropogenic plus natural factors. Absolutely. How can one disagree? I don't think the natural factors are always barriers. Part of the tipping point idea is, of course, that they can be multipliers as well to how those natural factors sort of play out. But yeah, that's the correct formulation. It's human action and natural factors. These are the things that are coming together. About communists and technocracy, absolutely. Rajeshwari, there are many and complicated ways of course, the record of the Soviet Union, terrible in terms of its environmental record and so on, and deriving from, if you like, not deriving from the science itself, which I think we shouldn't be letting go of, but deriving from particular structures of power and the ways in which those structures of power shape Soviet society, and how the application of that structure of power can have consequences without other human beings being able to fight back. Fundamentally undemocratic character of Soviet power, much like the fundamentally undemocratic character of capitalist structures, is what makes these two united. It's not the science that generates. It's not the technical aspect in that sense, to my mind, which it is bureaucracies and technocracies that are generating, and those are two slightly different things.
Right. So there is, I think Sharad was saying that that his question was more related to Rajesh. So you answered a bit of Rajesh, and that technologism is actually also is a part of the story. That's what I think Sharad's point was. I think you answered. So there is Vasudha's question, which is that what do you think about Capitalocene versus Anthropocene, or should we, what is it called, provincialize the Anthropocene? Should we provincialize? Is it right? I think should we provincialize Anthropocene? So of course that play on Dipesh's thing, but so what would you say? Is that, though I can't understand what is provincializing the Anthropocene will mean? That means, is it a European concept or?
Yes, that's what it means.
Yeah, Anish. Yeah.
Sorry,
Can I come in, Prabhu?
Yeah. Yes.
I think Yeah, I think I didn't have the time to write it up. Basically, one is, I mean, if we accept the point that Capitalocene is critical, then what Anish is saying is also important, that the earlier histories of climate become environmental histories, but not necessarily, they are not grist to our mill. But Kathleen Morrison actually has picked up this word of the patients provincializing Europe, and said that we need to provincialize the Anthropocene as well. And that rather than reject the Anthropocene completely, because if Anthropocene is a global historical moment, then there are many histories leading to it, not just England. Because the history of colonialism, Indian history, how do we? So we'll have to also have a history, the moment of entry maybe into the Capitalocene, or whatever we choose to. But I think somewhere in completely dispensing with the word Anthropocene, we have to be careful, because it is a global moment of history. And the other histories don't necessarily connect only through simple capitalism, maybe, if you want to have, for want of any other word. They connect differently. And that is what I meant by asking. So I'm actually reverting to the debate on the Anthropocene. Yes, Anish.
So the Capitalocene
I'll switch off. Yeah.
To my mind, I really like Ian Angus's answer to this question about the Capitalocene versus the Anthropocene. And he's saying that, look, you look at what the scientists are actually saying when they're talking about Anthropocene. The consensus, they're repeatedly talking about the fact that this is not a species level question. This is actually, some people have been responsible. It's remarkable, but scientists have been saying this consistently, which is why I actually wanted to point out that this debate about all the human species being responsible is actually fundamentally a social sciences and humanities debate, not a science debate, remarkably enough. The technocrats and others who have been looking at the numbers and looking at this carefully actually arrive at the correct position, which is that some people have generated the crisis, not everyone, and they say it repeatedly. So if what is at stake in saying Capitalocene rather than Anthropocene is to say that that we are correcting a bias that puts it at the species level, it doesn't ring true. That's not what the Anthropocene as a discourse has done in our existence and in our sort of everyday lives. So, you know, why are you sort of generating these things? Why Anthropocene okay but anthropogenic not okay? Or why is rather the reverse? Why is anthropogenic okay but not Anthropocene? When we say anthropogenic, we seem to mean that, you know, it is human beings who caused it, but not all human beings. Right? Surely we can have the same position in a certain sense, as long as we try to understand the structures. How much effort do we want to spend into this debate about should we call it the Capitalocene when everybody else is calling it the Anthropocene, but not saying all the bad things that we're worried about. The only person saying the bad things that we're worried about are social scientists. It's a very strange situation. So I think Ian Angus's little note on the Capitalocene, Anthropocene is actually quite incisive. If by provincializing the Anthropocene you mean that we should be drawing out the connections and how this spreads and so on, absolutely. That if that's what provincializing the Anthropocene means, is that we have to move beyond England. Of course, the story moves beyond England. It moves beyond England through imperialism, through colonialism, through a number of other mechanisms, through unequal relations of power. Always remembering that it's not sort of all human beings, but these, you know, it's people who are benefiting from these structures of growing fossil capital who are driving this process. And whether that's a first world or versus third world thing, whether that's in elites in the first world versus poor in the third world thing, in all of those instances, absolutely, we have to start tracing more and more connections. That's part of what we should be doing here in India. That's part of what we need to be doing as historians, as I'm saying, elsewhere. If that's what it means, absolutely. I'm less convinced by the more epistemological shifts that sometimes are associated with the idea of provincializing Europe. And I find it hard to the analog with respect to the Anthropocene. Connecting, tracing more connections, absolutely.
Anish, there's just 5 minutes, I think, or 3-4 minutes. I think there's a question from Aparna. but which is lost in this kind of scrolling chat. I would like if Aparna can ask that. It has to do with something about archives. I think I saw it. If she asks that, and there's a last, I suppose the last point which is made by Lavanya. I think you may be simplifying the idea of agency and nature. As Timothy Mitchell says, giving agency to nature means making this issue of power and agency in question instead of an answer known in advance. If that's a last point, but I think Aparna, if she can ask the question about archives. I'm sorry, I just can't find the link here. Aparna, are you there? Aparna, hello. I think
she's got a call.
Oh, she's got a call. But can you see, Naga, can you see her question by any chance? I can't see. I was just saw it. Thanks, Anish, for your very interesting talk. I wonder if you say more about historians who use what you call archives of society. You mentioned such diverse material, art, work, instrument records. So she wanted a little more clarification on your so-called archives of society, which is important for history in climate, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Just to start repeating what I said earlier, that a lot of the typical sort of pattern in which this work is happening is very, very seriously the science. Often the broad frameworks are coming out of the broad periodizations of, these were periods of drought, and these many El Nino events happened at these points of time, are coming from the archives of nature. But very precisely, actually, a variety of ways in which human society reflects on its climate, because it is embedded in its climate, right? Here we're returning to things like and another sort of thread that I never mentioned at all, one which is much more sort of was prescient and respectable here, the Annals school, of course, which has looked at all of these different kinds of records that one can piece together meticulously. That one has to be much more careful, of course, about these records. They're situated, they're difficult to use, they're often inconsistent. You'll find them for some years and not for other years, fragmentary as a result. But there's some remarkable work that's happening. So for instance, the one that sort of shocked me when I was, people have sort of used large numbers of artworks and pulled together works of art that are describing different landscapes, and then trying to see whether we can find peaks and spikes and troughs and so on in the periods when these are created, and whether from there we can actually conclude something interesting about climate weather events. And sort of, again, obviously human perceptions are there in every painting, but not just that. I think about how weather was working out in that period of time. And it strikes me that there's some sort of incredibly interesting detective work that's involved. And I think doing that detective work for 30 years leads Laduri to sort of rethink his initial proposition. His initial proposition in the 70s was that in the aggregate, climate doesn't really have much of an impact on human society. By the time you get to work that I don't think has been translated yet. He's now written a 3-volume sort of history of climate and the ways in which it's shaping and reshaping the landscape. And that's based on really doing this work of archives of society and archives of nature and bringing them together. I think the conversation between them is really the critical thing. We'll find references to weather in almost any archive that we're using, because human life is connected.
Prabhu, question?
Yeah, so there's just 1 minute left, I suppose, and I think we can't have, there are several other questions. Bittu asked this question. Anish, I have a question about in methodology. In evolutionary biology, we face difficulties with determining historical causal factors from correlations in time. And we use a specific and limited set of tools to get at causation. This seems important in terms of learning lessons from history around climate change. So, for example, in the Little Ice Age, what are the ways one can look for traces of causality about climate and its effects on human society? like that. So basically, so I think we move from agentiality to causality. Causality is, of course, a different structure of understanding, but agentiality with choice and intentionality is central to agentiality, to agential aspect. So there you made that distinction. But I think Bittu is asking, is there a way in which causal relations can be separated out or brought out? In like at least from the learnings from the Little Ice Age thing that you mentioned, which was not, can we bring back some aspect of causality, historians understanding causality into the present study of? Is that what I think? That's what she meant.
I think she means it as a general epistemological question about causation per se. How can we get at causation?
Yeah.
And it's obviously one of the hardest things to do. Some of the things are. Yeah, sorry. Some of the things are really questions of doing very similar processes. It's doing look for confounding variables. It's doing look for alternative pathways and alternative forms of explanations or alternative suggestions, and then look for where the evidence is in the balance of these things. In that sense, particularly for biology, forms of causation, so within the broader sciences, if I'm trying to think of ways in which we think about causation in history and the ways in which we think about causation in science, the closest we'd approach is actually in many ways the ways in which causation is thought about in biology. So one tries to sort of strengthen correlations, but of course, strengthened correlations are not necessarily causative relationships, where sometimes we can find more clinching sort of forms of evidence, but yeah, and there is a way in which you're always going to be limited, and you can always talk about sort of balance of probabilities.
Okay.
That's
Thank you.
I think there are analogies.
I'm sorry. I think we have just overshot the limit by Vandana for 7:15. We're just 7:17. First, this is my. I suppose a lot of people can write to you or tell you about this. There are a lot of other questions, which are obviously very rich talk you gave, at least very focused around this question. And thank you, Anish, for introducing us to a series of readings about how historians are handling these questions. And I'm sure that's going to be, I don't know how much scientists are going to benefit. Those several scientists are also writing that they find it interesting, the way you have dealt with the question. Thank you again. Thank you very much, Anish. And maybe we should
Thank you. It's been
you can a round of applause to you for a wonderful talk. Thanks everyone. I suppose the next talk. Yeah. Thanks Vandana for hosting and allowing us to cross over for 2 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, no worries. I wish we could have gone on for longer. This was.
Yeah, Vandana. We'll continue the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.